It's so good to see many people from the lunchtime talk. So you'll have some, I'm sure, great questions on tap. So I'm going to quickly introduce Sister Angela Reed. And so for those of you who were here at lunch, you get to hear it a second time. So Sister Angela is a Sister of Mercy. She's a Catholic sister, and for many years she managed her congregation's safe house for women and children in Melbourne. She's also an activist committed to advancing the human rights of all with a focus on the elimination of violence against women and human trafficking. She's now currently acting coordinator of Mercy Global Action at the UN. So she represents her congregation at the UN with her organization's consultative status. And her Sisters of Mercy work in 47 countries, and at the UN they give voice to the experiences of those they serve all over the world. I've been following her interventions over the last many months. We met in May in New York City, and at various UN meetings. So she's getting a lot of attention, and is extremely effective, I think, in advocating for radical shifts in countries' approaches to human trafficking all over the world. And she's a scholar, and so those of you who are at our lunch talk will walk through a lot of her scholarship. She's educated in theology, counseling, social work, business governance, and has a PhD from the School of Global, Urban, and Social Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne. And her doctoral thesis is titled Exploiting Vulnerability, a Study of the Lives of Filipino Women Who Have Been Trafficked into Sex Work. And so her thesis, I've read it now twice. It's really an amazing piece of work, and I hope that in our conversation we can bring up some of the threads from her thesis. We can also talk about her current initiatives. But her scholarship really subverts stereotypes of a homogenous sex trafficking experience and proposes a path forward in responding to the voices of victims themselves. So please join me in welcoming Sister Angela. So over the next 45 minutes, I have some prepared questions for her. She has a little inkling, a small sense of the questions that I've proposed, but on any topic at any time, please raise your hand and we'll bring you into the conversation. If you want to take a tangent, if you want to go deeper, this is meant to be more of a conversation than a presentation. So know that you're all welcome to just jump in with the questions or comments that you might have. So in honor of the fact that we're being hosted by the Liu Institute for Asian Studies, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about the Philippine context for sex trafficking and the socio-historical forces that shaped and served to perpetuate sex trafficking in the Philippines.
Yeah, thank you. Well, as I did say at lunchtime, there are local factors in each country that contribute to trafficking. In the Philippines, there are specific historical factors that we talk about. For example, and I mentioned this at lunchtime too, the American military bases that have been in the Philippines for many, many years, and the whole notion of rest and recreation and bringing about the prostitution of Filipino women for their rest and recreation. And then when they moved on, then a lot of those military bases became red light districts, or what they refer to as, hotspots for sex tourism. So that's part of it. And of course, colonisation, when we look at the influence of different cultures coming in, first of all the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then the Americans. And at one small time there was the Japanese were also. Mm-hmm. So the Philippines has been colonised a number of times. And the whole militarisation process within the Philippines, and its impact on women and gendered violence, Catholicism as well, and its particular focus on the Madonna archetype and the importance of the woman, I guess, in a subservient type role, has influenced the way in which women are understood in that particular culture. I'm always very careful when I'm talking about another culture, that I don't generalise, because if I was a Filipino, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I generally try to work with Filipinas when I talk about the Philippines, and particularly the history of the Philippines. But they're kind of the main factors, and of course the Philippines has had a very its economic history is very checkered. You know, at one point it looked like being a advanced economy, but of course that's not the case, and it's now many people, and I'm not sure of the statistics, but are living in poverty in the Philippines, and so of course that affects the issue of human trafficking, and also the work of women and the export of labour. So we know that the Philippines is dependent on remittances from labour, overseas work and labour, and so women in particular in domestic services and in the informal economy are quite vulnerable to exploitation through human trafficking.
Yeah, thank you. So I checked, for those of you who follow human trafficking globally, the State Department annually publishes its Trafficking in Persons report, and that report assigns countries to tiers depending on how well they're doing in fighting and addressing human trafficking. And I was surprised to see that the Philippines has earned, according to the US State Department, a Tier 1 ranking, which is how the State Department actually ranks us, the United States. So it's an extremely high ranking, and I'm wondering what you think about that, if you know any more background on why that happened.
It's the first year that they've been ranked at that level. The Philippines has extraordinarily, its efforts in terms of law and anti-human trafficking law have been extraordinary. They've been leaders in the region. They've put forward proposals at the UN in relation to human trafficking and global action. I always say, like, it's a big country, a big population. Like, so it's very difficult to kind of to sit as the judge in terms of prosecutions or in terms of what they're doing to stop human trafficking. But their laws and their attempts at working at prevention is to be, acknowledged, and I think it's right that they are on that particular tier. Of course, they fall short of a lot of things, but in terms of trafficking, I think that they are as good as any other country. As good as the US and Australia and other countries that are really putting efforts towards anti-trafficking initiatives. But they're still framing it.
Yeah, so in the Philippines, is prostitution legal?
No, prostitution is illegal.
Okay.
So in that sense, you could say it's illegal, but it is, what would I call it? You would say that it's a blind eye is turned to it. So it happens, and in pseudonyms. So people are employed as guest relations officers, or they have different names. It's definitely an accepted reality in the Philippines. Unfortunately, what happens is that every now and then the police decide to arrest prostituted women, and so they'll stage a whole event where people are actually. I was actually visiting the red light district, and the police came in, and all the women disappeared, and then they grabbed a few women and took them off in the van and arrested them and said we're enforcing our laws, our prostitution laws. But it was fairly ineffective, and you can see it's not really focusing in the right place.
Yeah. Does anybody have any more questions about the local context? Yeah.
No.
Oh, you were stretching?
No, I was going to have a question, but it's not specifically local.
Go ahead, Patrick. Yes.
I'm curious, given the State Department ranking, are there actually countries that we know of that are doing an exceptionally good job with the control of human trafficking, and to what extent might that comport with the life course approach that you had discussed this afternoon?
It's debatable who's doing a good job, and it's very hard to measure the effectiveness. The TIP report, the Trafficking in Persons report that comes out of the US State Department, is controversial in some ways because, people question how nation states are being put on certain tiers. Nonetheless, it's still a good tool for looking at how countries are going. I can't say to you that I could name a country that is doing specifically well in anti-trafficking because we haven't yet established an international measure of effectiveness. It's a bit hard to answer it.
Further questions?
Who is arrested if prostitution is illegal?
In the Philippines? So in the Philippines, my experience is that the prostituted woman is arrested for prostituting herself. The customer or the buyer or the John or whatever you call it usually remains anonymous. And that's a difficulty. So that's an issue of discrimination and gendered discrimination.
You mentioned that sex tourism is one of the things that is driving demand. Is that one of the primary drivers of demand, or are there other?
Yes,
drivers?
no, it is one of the primary drivers of demand in the Philippines, and where I actually did the research in Cebu in the Philippines. Cebu is a beautiful place to go as a tourist. I remember when I first was writing about it, my opening statement was, Cebu is a hotspot for sex tourism. And one of my good Filipino friends challenged me and said, have you ever been to the beaches? And have you been to the, up into the forests? And so now I always say, and rightly so, Cebu is a beautiful island with pristine beaches and lovely places to holiday. Unfortunately, it also is a typical source country for sex tourism because it's easy to get to by boat, by plane. It has it's a city hub, so it's a lot of people come from the rural areas to settle for work in there, and so it's considered a very hot spot for sex tourism. But there is also local Filipinas that also go to prostitutes, but it's sex tourism is the main driver. Yeah.
This might be too soon to tell, but since the new president in the Philippines has been very enthusiastic about empowering vigilantes in the drug war, has that crossed over into other anti-vice raids by non-police actors or police actors?
Yeah, good question. I don't know whether Duterte has gone into the human trafficking arena, but I suspect that might be, as you say, his approach is certainly very militarised. I don't know how he will approach it, but it's a bit scary to think how he might go about it. I've spoken to my contacts in the Philippines, and they're uncertain as to how he'll move forward. But I don't think he's shy of expressing his first thoughts or opinions. So, might head that way.
All right, I'm going to ask the next series of questions, which is actually about your research methods. In your dissertation, you mentioned that you gave careful attention to the ethical dimensions of your study, and you talked about your ethical journey in setting up this research with such a vulnerable population and doing qualitative investigation. So could you talk about a little bit about that ethical journey and maybe also about the reflexivity aspect of your research?
Great, thank you. Yes, so I did, the ethical dimension of the research was an enormous part of the research. As you'd be familiar with, for any research with human persons, you need ethical clearance through the university. I assume that's the same here, and it certainly is in Australia. And I guess my background, I'd worked in women's services with women who were victims of family violence and homelessness, and so I have a sensitivity to the issues. And I was very aware when I was looking at doing trafficking research that it would be considered a high risk in the ethical domain. And so I really spent a long time looking at what the ethical issues were. One of the most important ones was cross-cultural research. The fact that myself as an Australian would be going and researching Filipinas is an ethical question in itself. Was I, being colonialist? Was I taking the stance that, I'm going to research the other? But that wasn't the case for me. I went to the Philippines because the Good Shepherd sisters actually had a service that they were running for formerly trafficked women, and I had met many Filipino women in my work in Australia. And so I had a particular desire to come to know them. And I really didn't want to do it in a way that looked in any way or reflected in any way some kind of white superiority or white privilege. I was aware when I lived there that I was very privileged, that I am very privileged. But my main motivation was to find out from them what were the issues of trafficking. We know that in theory there are so many ways that trafficking has been problematised, but what did they think about it? So I formed a very small committee within the Philippines, and I was the only non-Filipino, and I asked about what would some of the issues be in relation to undertaking research, and most importantly, do you want me to do this research, and what kind of research do you want me to do? And so it was actually the sisters in the Philippines who said, we want to know what the experience is, we want to know, are we responding appropriately to the women? So that was one aspect of the ethical dimension. And then there's the whole issue of informed consent. These women had had little consent most of their lives. So how was I going to ensure that I had their consent, that they understood what I was doing? And so a lot of work went into explaining, running groups with the women, and really allowing them to give their consent not only once, but every time that they were part of the research. We explained what we were going to do and said, you don't have to partake in this. This is your choice. The majority of the women, all of the women, wanted to partake in it because they wanted to make a difference. And in fact, when we finished up after 6 months, they said, oh, have we finished already? We really want to do it again. They really enjoyed it. I made it participatory. We made it meaningful for them. And for many of them, they felt that it was transformative, that they had the opportunity to share their story.
Yeah, and so your reflexive research practice.
So in terms of my own reflexivity as a social worker, part of that I learned working in a family violence refuge, looking at, well, where does my agenda come into it? How do I not put words into other people's mouths? Or how do I know that I'm not seeking answers because I want that answer? How do you check that? How do you keep check of that? So some of the ways that I did that was I kept a research journal. And so I wrote down what was happening. And at times I found myself, when one of the most amazing forms of reflexivity was I would take I would do an interview with a woman, and we had a translator, a bicultural research assistant, Marietta Latonio, and she would translate. So I had that on a tape. That exact same night I would go home and I would listen and transcribe the interview. So I had to listen to myself in English, I had to listen to the translator translate and then get... So it took it could take 3 or 4 hours to do one transcript. And you'd write it and sometimes I'd have to go back and listen again. Tedious, but incredible in terms of reflexivity, because I'd say to myself, why did I ask that? Why didn't I remain silent when she said that? So you started to realise very quickly when your agenda was coming in. So those were two forms. And then, of course, I had supervision. And then I set up with this small group. I would give them the themes and talk with them and say, am I on the right track? Does this sound right? And then the other thing that I did to ensure that my agenda wasn't coming over was when I had my second interview with the women, I would sort of recap what I heard them say and ask them, was that right? So they're just some of the ways.
Yeah.
While you were interviewing these women, were they aware that you were a sister? Because possibly, like, knowing that, they would have been more trusting in you.
Yeah, it's a good. Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. There are two sides to that coin. On the one hand, they could think that I was more trustworthy. On the other hand, they could feel a little bit intimidated because in the Philippines, especially, sisters are very much considered. They're part of the Catholic hierarchy, I suppose, and so there was always an ethical concern that they may want to give me the right answers, they may want to do whatever I ask them or to partake in that. So some of the ways that I tried to minimise that factor, I couldn't completely be sure that it wasn't there, but I minimised it by first of all going and living in the refuge for a month. I didn't actually live on the premises when I was doing the interviews, again for ethical reasons. I partook in all the activities, and I've never worn a habit, so that kind of helped. So in the Philippines, they kind of were a bit suspicious about whether I was a real nun anyway, because I didn't have the habit on. So in that sense, it could have worked to my advantage. But I felt like I had a genuine encounter with those women, and one of the ways that I did that was in the first focus group, I told them my life story. So, some people would say, ethically, is that good for the researcher to share her personal stories? But within the feminist framework, it's very much considered a way of breaking down barriers of, privilege or so on. So, yeah.
I imagine that the people that you work with, because you were doing research, they identify themselves as victims. Here in the United States, it's often the case that they don't self-identify as victims because their trafficker, they consider their boyfriend meeting some sort of need for them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering whether that you have whether that's you see that in the Philippines as well, and then if so, have you found any that there's any successful approaches to help them to recognize that they're being exploited?
It's a good question too. I think I need to acknowledge that the women who I interviewed were already in a program when I interviewed them. So they were part of the Good Shepherd Welcome House program, which is a drop-in centre. Some of them were still being trafficked, or they were still within a complex relationship with either the trafficker or, like you say, they may have considered them to be a boyfriend or a partner. Or they also didn't identify themselves, they didn't say, I'm a victim of trafficking. But some of the criteria that I set out in the sort of invitation to be part of the focus groups was, have you come to the Welcome House for support in this way? Would you consider yourself a victim of human trafficking? If you're not sure, you might want to discuss this with somebody else, not me, of course. And so in that sense, they then came forward and said, I want to be part of it because I am a victim of human trafficking. But then the ambiguity of their own, their sense, when we were talking, they would often, move in and out of saying, well, I was responsible for my own actions and I made choices, and they were like struggling with their own sense of agency within the constraints of their life. So it was a tricky one, but it was important that I didn't define them as being trafficked. They were the ones who came and said, yes, I was trafficked, but same thing, yeah. I think similar, yeah.
So continuing with your research and your role as being a sister, so how did your experience as a Catholic sister engaged in this research affect you, given the power dynamics within the church, including in the Philippines, in terms of power and powerlessness and marginalization?
I've been asked this question in relation to women and the church, and my own sense of, being a woman within the church and the power dynamic, that how did I reconcile working with this issue? I guess I see myself as being a leader in the church in this type of research, and in many ways I've been empowered because I am a member within the church, but I also consider myself a reformist within the church, and giving voice to women's experiences is important and was part of the process for me of part of my own, claiming my own leadership and role as a woman within the church.
Yeah. And you write too that you wanted to embrace the long tradition of feminism in the Philippines. So how did Filipino feminism affect your work? What did you learn from it?
Well, I mean, when I read about people power and the role of women's groups in the Philippines, such as Gabriela, which is a huge collective of women's organisations, and that was started by a Benedictine sister. And I knew that also the sisters, the Good Shepherd sisters, had been a big part of the people power in the Philippines. And my own encounter with Filipino sisters was that they weren't subservient. They were very clear about their oppression by colonial states, but also gendered issues of gender. And so they kind of, I would say that they had a Western, both a Western Eastern mix of feminism. And so in some ways I found it a little intimidating because they stand up and claim their rights, and I learnt a lot from the Filipino women. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but I certainly admire the way that the Filipino activist women that I have met continue to chip away at the issues. And that whole notion of intersectionality. So they're not oppressed purely because they're a woman, but there are other issues. So they see the feminist type of feminism in the Philippines looks at issues of colonisation, looks at issues of economic marginalisation, class, and discrimination on those terms. So it's a very comprehensive understanding of feminism. Yeah.
Do you have any questions? I'm happy to keep going with mine, but I don't want to dominate. Yeah.
What was the average age of the women that you interviewed?
So all of the women I interviewed were over 18. The average age was 21, but the average age at which they had been trafficked was 15. But for ethical reasons, the women had to be over 18. But I will tell you that when I first arrived in the Philippines, I was, a little tentative. I was going to live in a drop-in centre for prostituted women, and I thought, what are they going to think of me? How am I going to relate to these women? I'd been working in women's refuges in Australia, but I was just, a little uncertain. And I arrived at this refuge, and these women all ran to me and grabbed my suitcase and put their arm around me and took me upstairs and sang a song of welcome. And it was the most extraordinary experience, humbling experience, to realise that these women wanted me. I've never felt so embraced. And it's interesting, often people say, well, what's it like to live in the Philippines and then come and live in New York? Well, New York is a rich place to be, but it's lonely. The Philippines is a poor place to be, but it's full of, I was never lonely. So I think it was something about this sense of solidarity, and the other incredible thing that I found was, in Australia, and I'd say similarly here, a person who is in need of social support, social work, the kind of approach is, what's wrong with you? What have you, why haven't you got money? Why haven't you got a job? Why haven't you done this? In the Philippines, every time a woman came to the door, there were no questions asked. It was assumed. It was like we knew that this woman was part of a system, an oppressive system, and that we weren't pathologising her, that we were aware that there was a system of oppression. And so there was an enormous sense of solidarity in being in that environment. Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the life course approach that you've generated out of your research?
Yeah, so when I was interviewing the women, I decided that I would ask them, what my initial question was, what is the trafficking experience? It was a phenomenological study looking at what is the experience of being trafficked. And then my first visit there, I began to see that they started to talk to me about their childhood and their adolescence, and it started to occur to me that this event of trafficking is not so much an event, or this victimisation through sexual exploitation is not so much a one-off event, but kind of a series and process of victimisation. And so I started to read all sorts of theories about in psychology, about trafficking and so on. And I came across the life course theory, which is very much came out of the psychological realm. And the life course theory says that, in very simple terms, it says that what happens at one point in life affects and has an impact on the rest of your life, which nobody here would disagree. But there are certain events in your life that are life-changing. We have like transitions that may not necessarily be life-changing, but there are life-changing events that occur, and that these events affect and impact who we are into the future. So I started to think about the life course theory in terms of human trafficking. And the other thing about the life course theory is that it looks at the relationship between the personal and the environmental and external factors. And I think for those of you who were at the lunchtime talk, I talked about being challenged by one of the women who said, there are so many people who live in poverty in the Philippines, but not all of them are trafficked. So there was this thing inside me that said, well, I can't say it's purely about poverty, that trafficking happens because of poverty. There has to be other factors. Why does one woman get trafficked and another not? And so when I looked at this life course perspective, I was able to say, well, the interplay between the personal life story with the particular political, social and economic environment, when that came together, it created the vulnerability to trafficking. And what I loved about the life course theory is that everybody's alive and everybody lives and everybody has their own life course. And so people could relate to their own life events. I mean, I've done workshops where I've asked people to do the life journey and to mark the transitions and to mark the life events and ask what were the defining moments. I've done it personally myself, and I was able to share that with the women who were trafficked. And so people can relate very easily to this notion of the life course perspective.
So in human trafficking, there's a term that strikes me as being more part of that criminal justice framework for trafficking, which is that people get trapped in trafficking. They get that there's that idea of being trapped, that one moment you are in and in another moment you're not. So should we lay that aside, put that aside, that idea that you get trapped into trafficking?
You might say that you had a trafficking event, and that for that series of time, like there were certain people in the women who participated in the research who were trapped for a number of years, not necessarily in the way that we generally see. They weren't chained up, but they were trapped through debt bondage. They were trapped through perhaps thinking that somebody was caring for them. They were trapped psychologically, but this idea of falling into trafficking, or becoming a victim of trafficking, I think it's few and far between. There'll always be someone who'll say, but I know someone who was, their life story was, they were well educated, they had a safe, secure community environment, and they were trafficked. But it's very rare. In the States, it's very rare. The chances of my niece, who's 21, or my niece who's 15 getting trafficked is almost zero. But we tend to talk about it in the dominant discourse. We tend to say, anyone can be trafficked, and we need to be, we need to look out for people and so on. It's not really the case. It's much more sinister.
Speaking of being trapped in trafficking, how did these women get out of that system in order to seek refuge where you were?
Okay.
Because some of them come fearing that someone will follow them or track them down.
Good question. In the particular area that I was working, one of the practices that the Good Shepherd service offered or did was went into the red light district, or the area that was considered to be the red light district, every night. They never rescued. They went in and they offered pastoral care to the women. And so for the first month that I was there, I also accompanied the social workers. And what they did was they talked with them and they told them, you know where we are, and you can come there whenever you're able to, because we realised that they might have looked as if they were free, but they weren't necessarily free. And also, women have told us later on that it took them 12 months to really believe that we weren't going to traffic them. And so they needed to make the choice to come when they were ready. That was part of giving them a sense of self-determination. Now, some people would argue, no, if she's being trafficked, if she's being exploited, and you have the facility, you need to, rescue that woman. But I would argue that from my experience of talking with the women who have been rescued, they found it a very traumatic experience. So to answer your question, the women that came to the centre came when they could and came when they were ready, and they might have arrived in the middle of the night, or they might have arrived in the day, and they might have come and gone several times. So again, it was a process.
So I guess I was asking, was the centre threatened by other women?
No. Now, it's interesting because a lot of people were concerned about my safety and the safety of the other sisters, the safety of the people that were there. The sad reality in this particular situation, and I can say the same when I was working in family violence in Melbourne, Australia, we ran a safe house. It was called High Security. We never gave the address out. But the fact is that these women were easily replaceable. And so it was, in terms of the traffickers, they cut their losses. So in many instances, they weren't chasing the women. Again, I think it can be, certainly there would be instances where that's the case. But again, I think it might be more of a stereotype that, that this person is going to be chased and they move on. They've lost them, they get another one. They've got 2 years out of them. I mean, it's really sad when you're talking about the commodification of human beings in this way, but that seems to be the reality.
George.
What policy policy conclusions of your research? I mean, what would you recommend, say, for the church and for government or social work and internationally?
So at the moment I work at the United Nations, work for Mercy International at the United Nations. So part of the policy that we're trying to influence is to change the narrative, to stop talking about trafficking as if it's a random act of victimisation, and to talk about preventative measures. We need to do prevention, and we need to do post-recovery, of course. But to try and look at the root causes of trafficking, to put it within the context of the life course, to put it within the context of gendered violence, lack of education, of vulnerabilities, to see countries and states take responsibility for their citizens. That's kind of the main focus that we're taking, and yeah, prevention is key, is a key aspect of our approach. Yeah.
And you've developed indicators.
So yes, thank you.
That yeah.
So I've developed 17 what I call optimal life course conditions, and they're based on exactly the opposite experiences of what the women describe as happening in their childhood. For example, unsafe environment, violent environment. So one of the core conditions is to live free from violence. And then we're calling upon the different human rights conventions that actually, frame those optimal life course conditions within the human rights conventions, but also within the teachings of the church. Also, that we, my plans for you, Jeremiah says, my plans for you are a future of hope, not disaster. So to recognise that the human dignity of each person is to be realised. So again, throughout those optimal life course conditions, bringing in the teachings of the church, human rights conventions, and so on. Yeah.
And they're divided according to the age.
Yes.
Yes.
So I've got 5 optimal life course conditions that are really, they're divided into childhood, adolescence and adulthood. And again, that was the way that I worked with the women in the Philippines. So they talked about in childhood, these were the vulnerabilities. Education. So of course in childhood, education is essential because the majority of the women who I worked with had less than elementary, like mid-elementary was the average schooling. So though that was really important. And then in adolescence, psychological and sexual health. So really important factors, really important conditions that need to be there to ensure that there is less vulnerability to trafficking. And so I'm be encouraging not only nation states but community groups to look at these conditions and to see, almost like hold it up as a litmus test and see, can we help prevent trafficking by creating these conditions early on in life. So it's very much a preventative approach.
There was another hand up.
Yeah, my question was just on like the reintegration process, because I guess that's like once you've talked to them or once they've been to the center, where do they like go from there?
Yeah, so the Good Shepherds in Cebu run what they call a recovery centre. And the first time that I was going to visit there, the sister who was in charge was very protective, and rightly so, of the environment. And she said to me, it's like going into an intensive care unit. These women have been violated in so many ways, and they're very vulnerable. They're vulnerable to being re-trafficked. They often have very low self-esteem, and they need routine, because they may not have had, even in their early childhood, any sense of routine, like schooling, sense of boundaries. And for those that had experienced sexual abuse, there was confusion around sexuality. So in many ways it was like walking into an intensive care unit, and we needed to approach the women with the greatest sensitivity, recognising that they have needs and concerns and desires to, be educated or whatever, but they were the ones who led their recovery. When I asked the women what was the first and the most important thing about their recovery, many of them said that it was the opportunity to tell their story. Even though they, once their initial need for food and accommodation and safety, they believed that the psychological and the spiritual dimension was vitally important to their recovery. And it's an expensive pursuit. I don't like to talk about recovery in terms of economics, but some of these women have been in recovery for 6-7 years because they needed to, get educated. They needed to build up their self-esteem through all sorts of programs, and to be able to be skilled and given skills to ensure that they weren't re-trafficked. And unfortunately, women and girls are re-trafficked because it's due to the economic and social factors that they're rendered vulnerable to such a thing.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
The only reason there's trafficking, sexual trafficking, is because there's a demand.
Mm-hmm.
So do you know of what's happening in that?
There's a lot in terms of demand, and I guess my response to you is there's no doubt about it, that without demand there is no trafficking. I've kind of, and there are people who have been working on the demand factor, particularly here in the United States. In Australia, there's very active groups who are looking at demand. I'm sort of going the opposite way and saying, I know that's being taken care of. Yes, it absolutely is an issue. But I went to supply, if you like, and looked at if women are given all the opportunities like education, proper health, opportunities for work, the demand might be there, but there'll be no supply. Now, that's pretty idealistic, but my theory is let's cut off supply. Let's see if women come forward, if they're well educated, if they have the option. All of the women that I spoke to said, I never want my child to be prostituted. I never wanted to be prostituted. I fell into this. If I had have had options, if I had have had, then I wouldn't have. So I suspect that if we cut off supply, if we give supply, cut off supply and ensure that women and girls have the greatest opportunities, as I've had in life, that's another approach.
Well, this is a wonderful note of hope to end this conversation, and please join me in thanking Sister Angela.
Thank you.